Anonymity of Sussex Bill, second reading.
Now, Sir Christopher Chipp.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of the Anonymity of Suspects Bill. But before doing that, perhaps I can briefly explain why I did not move the previous bill in relation to mobile homes, and that's because the government has agreed that my mobile homes pitch fees bill, which is set for second reading on Friday the 18th of November, will have government support. That is the bill which specifies a change from RPI to CPI as the maximum annual increase in pitch fees, which would change the maximum from what is now 12.5% to 10.1%. So on the basis of that good news, I thought it would be better to raise a separate subject. Of course I will.
I thank him for giving way. I just wanted to thank him for his assiduous work campaigning for this change, and just to put on record my great pleasure at the government for supporting the bill going forwards in November. That will make such a difference to all our Park Home residents.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. So we can't count our chickens yet, but let's hope that it all will go smoothly in November. And can I also say that it's a pleasure, and I'm most grateful to the honourable lady for allowing me time to speak today, because she could have spoken for the whole half hour, and I'm sure she would have had more than enough material. But I didn't intervene on that because if I had done, I would have just referred to the fact that Tony Juniper from the Green Party and a former candidate for the Green Party and the director of Friends of the Earth is apparently on record as saying the right to roam everywhere cannot be supported by him because remote, quiet areas are getting fewer and fewer. So I'm glad that we've got time to reflect upon not just what the honourable lady said, but also what Tony Juniper says before we come back to... Of course I will.
Well, he invites me, in a sense, to respond, and I would simply point out that I made very clear in my speech in favour of my bill that I was talking about increasing the access from 8% of English land to 30%, so I'm quite sure there'll be plenty of space for all of that wonderful nature to flourish as it should.
All right. We must pass on, Mr Deputy Speaker, to this important subject of the anonymity of suspects. And my interest in this subject arose because I attended a meeting of a relatively new organisation called Falsely Accused Individuals for Reform. And it came about the time that I was preparing what private members' bills I might be putting forward for this session. And I must say I was very impressed by what was said at that gathering, because essentially this is a campaign by people who have been falsely accused and whose lives have been completely wrecked as a consequence. And perhaps I can just read briefly from what Sir Cliff Richard said to the Falsely Accused Individuals for Reform meeting. Sir Cliff, you will recall, Mr Deputy Speaker, is Britain's all-time biggest selling male artist, with I think 22 million singles to his name. And he said, "I'm pleased to support the new pressure group, Falsely Accused Individuals for Reform. Being falsely accused myself and having that exposed in the media was the worst thing that has happened to me in my entire life. Even though untrue, the stigma is almost impossible to eradicate. Hence the importance of this campaign to change the law to provide for anonymity before charge in sexual allegations, and hence my continued work with FAIR in the future. Had this proposed change in the law been enacted when the police decided to raid my apartment following the allegations of a fantasist, the BBC would not have been able to film this event, name me, even though the South Yorkshire Police had decided not to, and so plunge my life and those close to me into fear and misery." And for those of...
Will you give way on
Yes, of course I will.
He's making an excellent point, and the BBC were ticked off about what happened. So what role does the media have in place with regards to his bill, and how much do they hold an accountability in such incidents?
Well, my bill, clause 2 of my bill, would extend the restrictions, the criminality which would be associated with premature disclosure in relation to somebody being a suspect, it would extend to corporations. So the controlling forces within the BBC were that this legislation to have been on the statute book at the time that they put up, they filmed, didn't they? They filmed the helicopters above Sir Cliff's residence, and in the end, I think the BBC was ordered to pay Sir Cliff £210,000 in damages for breach of privacy. That goes back to, it was August 2014 that the police did that. But it took a long time for Sir Cliff to be able to clear his name. And I think it's clear that even now he still bears the scars of that ordeal, which should never have happened. And this bill is designed to prevent other people similarly being afflicted, because somebody makes an accusation anonymously. Sometimes the police then act upon it, and then they tip off the media, or brief the media or social media as to what has happened, thereby destroying the principles which I think should be there, which are that people are innocent until proved guilty, and that they should be able to enjoy anonymity until such time as they might be charged with an offence. Of course, I'll go back.
Thank you to my honourable friend for giving way. He raises the subject of anonymity, and we've all seen how the abuse on social media and the impact that abuse on social media has on many people in the public eye, including celebrities and superstars like Sir Keith Richard, but also on members of Parliament and councillors and other people. So, would he agree that anonymity in social media is something that needs to be addressed?
Well, that's an enormous subject. I think the online harms bill might be an opportunity for my honourable friend to be able to raise that. But this bill is confined to the circumstances in which somebody is accused of being and is suspected of being guilty of a criminal offence, but that is then abused by the people who are close to the investigation, making a tip-off and saying that this person has been arrested, and quite often they're never charged. And indeed, the Paul Gambaccini case is another example of a really serious situation where he was minding his own business at 6 o'clock in the morning. There was a raid on his house. And he was, the fact that he'd been arrested, that was communicated by the Metropolitan Police to journalists, and in the end, Paul Gambaccini was paid £250,000 by the Metropolitan Police, 65,000 of those in damages and the rest in legal costs over breaches of privacy. And the Metropolitan Police also agreed to apologise for the disclosure of that private information. But the trouble with all that is it's after the event, and it's only the people who are most resilient and probably very wealthy who can actually afford to engage in the litigation which might follow from such events. And that's why I think it's better to have prevention rather than a cure, and to deter this type of behaviour. Of course I would.
He's making some very good points about anonymity and innocent till proven guilty. However, we've also seen on the likes of Harvey Weinstein that actually it was because of the publicity that victims came forward to prove how big the case is. So how do we get this balance right between those who are accused and making sure that they are protected, but also making sure that when people do come forward, there's enough evidence out there, especially for the great and powerful, to make sure that balance is correct for both the victim and the accused?
Well, I've endeavoured to do that in the drafting of this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and that's why Clause 1, which sets out the offence of disclosing the identity of a suspect makes it quite clear, clause 1.1, subject to the exception in subsection 2. And I think the intervention of my honourable friend is covered by the exceptions which are set out in subsection 2 of this bill. So this is a balanced bill. It's not just confined to cases of alleged sexual crimes, but to crimes in general, because depending on the status that a person has, the allegation that, for example, they are in hop to the inland revenue may be incredibly damaging to them. And I know that the HMRC is absolutely compliant with the principles that you shouldn't disclose details about people's tax affairs, and I think the HMRC is one of the best organisations in meeting those very high standards. But other organisations, sadly, are not so much, and that's so. I recognise that there are circumstances in which it is said that by disclosing the person who is under suspicion, then that may lead to other people coming forward. But that shouldn't be the situation and it certainly wasn't the case in relation to Cliff Richard and Paul Gambaccini and a lot of others. So that's why I've got those exemptions set out in the bill. And so basically the main exemption will be where the disclosure is reasonably necessary for the prevention or detection of crime or for the administration of justice and so on. So those I've drafted this bill. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I hope that, because we haven't got much time to discuss it today, I hope that my right honourable friend on the front bench will agree to actually have a meeting to discuss this, because I think this is a really serious subject, and I think it would be useful to be able to discuss with him where we can go in relation to this, because there's a lot of public feeling out there that something has got to be done, and we can't allow heroes in the country to be brought low by these allegations, which then turn out to be false, but because they've been ventilated in public, they have caused irreparable damage to the people adversely affected. And another person who has been the subject of such false allegations is our former parliamentary Conservative colleague Harvey Proctor. I think he's been put through the hoop on this. Although in the end he's got, I think, a payout of £800,000 from the police. Of course, who ends up paying that? We do. That's one thing, and ultimately he has, I think, his life has been completely wrecked as a result of those false allegations which were made against him on two separate occasions. And he was not in a position, he was a man without much in terms of resources, he was not in a position on his own to be able to seek redress. So I mention his name because he's not a great star, wasn't a great star in the media and television, and who had the resources. But even for somebody like Paul Gambaccini, immediately as this information came out into the open, he was suspended from being able to do his radio programmes on the BBC, and he lost a whole year's work. And similarly, we look and see that the consequences for Cliff... No, well, I won't actually, because I'm just going to finish. But the consequences for Cliff Richards, in Cliff Richards' case, was that Cliff Richards' charities suffered to the extent of probably more than £100,000 a year in lost income while he was in suspicion. So I have pleasure, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in moving the second reading of this bill and hoping that in due course I'll be able to have a meeting with the Minister to discuss its contents.
Is the bill being now read a second time, and I'll call the Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And can I start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Christchurch, for bringing this important subject to the floor of the House. I'd also like to thank and commend all colleagues who've taken part in the debate, including my honourable friend, the member for Hastings and Rye, my honourable friend, the member for Bosworth. And in this debate, we've heard about some of the real human consequences of some of the issues involved, and it is right and proper that we take time on a Friday to debate these matters. The underlying issue is one on which views do vary, and my honourable friend set out his arguments very helpfully. He's drawn attention to the great harm, as I say, that can be done where people who are investigated by the police in connection with a crime, but who are not then charged, are identified as being under suspicion. And although it's often in the particular context of allegations...
Order. Debate to be resumed what day?
Friday the 18th of November, sir.
Friday the 18th of November.